The following podcast is a Scrum Inc. production.
Hi, and welcome back. I'm JJ Sutherland, the CEO of Scrum Inc., and welcome to the Agile CEO podcast. I'm joined this week by Jenny Wood. You and I met when you were at NatWest, and now you're at the Skipton Group. And I was just wondering if you could just sort of introduce yourself and sort of what your role has been over the past few companies that you put Agile into.
Hi, JJ, lovely to be here today, and thanks for inviting me. I've worked in Agile ways actually since the start of my career. You know, it's one of those where I find myself as I get further on in my career reflecting back on the good old days when we used to all work together in small teams to create something. But the last few roles that I've done have all had some element of Agile or learning transformation as a part of them, be it, you know, my time at Telstra, my time at NatWest, and now at Skipton Group, where I'm the group CIO, and we're going through our own Agile/transformation, not that I like to use those words. Our own evolution of how we deliver better value to customers is probably a better way of
that's
putting
better.
it.
I like that. I'm gonna totally steal that. Good. So tell me about Telstra and NatWest. I'm sure people are familiar with those companies, but the Skipton Group for an American audience. Tell me about the Skipton Group, where you're CIO and what does it do exactly?
So the Skipton Group is a mutual. So we're owned by our members. We're not a listed company as such. And as a part of that, we're here for a purpose. And we've got three main purposes that we run to. So we're here to help more people into homes, help people save for their future, and actually make sure that the membership of the group, which are the people who own us, matters. And so we give back to them. We're a little bit of a unique group because whilst we have a building society, which does mortgages and savings, we also own a real estate agency, Connells, which does about 10% of the sales in the UK. We have a software company, Jade World, which is a New Zealand-based software company, as well as two smaller entities, which is Skipton Business Finance and Skipton International, both of which do niche sort of financial products. So we're a little bit different because we don't just run one vertical, we run across a couple of verticals. But together, we still exist for that purpose of helping more people get the outcomes they're looking for in their future lives financially.
And that, in certain ways, what Agile, or whatever you want to call it, is focused on. It's like, how do we help people do stuff better to deliver more value? And you were saying you've done it through your whole career. Tell me about a little bit when it started for you, when you sort of came across Agile, and how your journey progressed from there.
So the first time I would have done Agile was actually at a small telco. And we were doing some work on putting out a new customer portal. And I was actually not in tech at that stage. I'd done one of these career shifts where you step out of tech. I was running the call centers and customer operations. And I was the business owner of a product that we were building to allow business and corporate customers to manage their telecommunications bills. And we ran small teams, aligned, cross-functional, with a very clear view of the purpose we were trying to deliver, with iterative paired programming development. And that probably was back in 2010, 2009. And we got out small pieces of value in a portal. We weren't big. We didn't have the ability to spend more than we had. And so for us, actually getting the most out of the teams, the most value out of the teams rapidly was really, really important. And it meant that you did stay focused on what you were doing. So it was really interesting to hear and see it from the other side of the fence. And then when I moved into Telstra, which is a larger telco, I got to run the technology side of that equation, which is really interesting as you come through. And it gives you a very different perspective when you're the one trying to make the delivery happen in line with the value that you're trying to create and balance the technical rails at the same time as the business value delivery.
Now, that's interesting that you sort of saw it from, sort of the call center customer service interaction part and then the technical side, because that's sort of usually the reverse journey for a lot of people who might have started seeing it in the technical part and then into a customer facing role.
Yeah, I did start my life in tech. And
Yeah.
so, had done a lot of work delivering to projects or systems as they were at that stage. For me, what it gave me and what it has given me is that real grounding in what's valuable. Too often we think it's the big things that are valuable. We sometimes think it's the massive piece of tech that we buy or the investments that we make in big capabilities. But often for customers and for colleagues, the small things make a bigger difference. And that's hard to explain if you've never lived it. The fact that you can trust your system to do what it needs you need it to do, the information being in the right spot, the words being the right words, those little things actually can make a big, incredible difference when you're talking about value. So having lived both sides of the conversation, it does give me a very different perspective on what value really is and what is that fastest path to value, and what can you choose to do later, perhaps, and what actually can't you choose to do later because it'll come back and bite you.
Yeah, it's interesting you say the words. I'm working with a company in Latin America that does agricultural services across, like, I don't know, 9 countries or something. And they actually said, picking the words in the portal that say, do you want to get this, I don't know, fertilizer or whatever, and the word for buy, because even though it's all Spanish, but it's different in different locations. And they said just changing that word really matters. And unless they had that kind of rapid feedback loop, they would never know. And they would just use the word that they use in one country in all 9.
It's fascinating. And you sort of talk about rapid feedback, and it comes into learning. It comes into being curious. And often what I've found as I've worked across different companies, the best question, and I use it with my kids, is what's the next thing we need to learn? What's the thing that's going to tell us what we can do next? And we've just started rolling out a new app for our Skipton customers. And we've rolled it out to a very small subset. So people who have borrowed from us and it only works for them. It doesn't work for the rest of our product set. And so we've picked the customers we've made that invitation available to. And what we've learned is the fallout rates from the migration actually weren't anywhere near as high as we thought they were going to be. We were anticipating 20 to 30%. We've had 1% fallout. The feedback on the migration has been really, really interesting. In fact, there's been a couple of questions that there's not enough friction in it. It doesn't feel as secure potentially as it could be because people had expected a little bit more friction in it. The team spent a long time designing out the friction. And so those things that we've been learning actually now allow us to pick up the pace of migration, but actually choose what to do next. And it's that iteration of let's try something, let's see what we can learn, let's make sure we've got the data monitoring in place to know who's falling out when. We're not seeing fallout because no one's migrating, and that's not the case. We know how many people are migrating. So those sorts of things are just really important as you go on the Agile journey, because it really is about learning. It's about what am I going to learn next, and what's the risk I can address next and bring forward so that we can get to a valuable outcome sooner.
And it's interesting you brought up curiosity, because when we spoke for the book, you said that you did some sort of personality index, and that curiosity is your top trait. And I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that curiosity as an Agile leader, someone's leading an Agile organization, and why you believe that's so important.
It comes from a belief that if you only ever head down the known and the straight line, you're only ever going to get what you see. And it becomes really hard sometimes to deviate if you know that, if you're just asking the same questions and doing the same things. People like process. People get embedded in process, and then people stop thinking about the process. And as a result, if you give people a new process, then people will follow the process. And when they get to the other end and the process fails, that's their challenge. The analogy I've used a few times, and you and I spoke about it earlier, is what you want is a world that's a bit like a bendy snake. And I actually have one here that one of my colleagues, Tony Christensen, gave to me when we used this analogy the first time. You can either have a stick, and when you put in a new process, you A to B, you have to break the stick. It's really hard, or you have to repoint the whole stick. Or you can have a little bendy snake, and you can learn something new, and you can deviate, and you can pivot, and you can turn. And what being an agile leader is for me, it's about learning new things. It's about asking questions that help people understand what the next thing is that they can learn. It's about giving them permission to learn, but helping them put some frameworks and some guardrails around that go, how do we make sure that you're only learning enough and not trying to learn everything, because otherwise you fall into the same sort of problem? Or how do you make sure that you've got the metrics in place to know that what you've learned tells you something? Because I heard a great analogy the other day, which was value is about a change in behavior, and it's a measurable change in behavior. And so what you should be doing is creating value by doing measurable changes of behavior. And that's what learning is about. And that's what curiosity is about. So what's the next thing I can learn? What can I know? What can I do differently? And my team will tell you that even in my latest surveys, I'm over-indexed on curiosity. And in fact, I've had to learn to tone back the questions because too many questions can be the same problem as too little.
That is a really interesting point of that, where you don't want too much freedom, because otherwise, as you said, you can ask questions for as long as one would like.
I could keep asking you questions about all sorts of things, as you and I discovered one night as we first met before you wrote your book. We had a fabulous, wide-ranging conversation, very little of it to do with Agile. And that's the skill of a leader, is actually what's the right question and why am I asking the question? Mm-hmm. And am I asking it because I want to prove my point, which is the wrong answer? Or am I asking it because I'm willing to learn what you tell me as a result of it, and I'm willing to adapt and change the path that we're taking as a result of what we've learned together? Having been a leader of a few Agile transformations, and I hate that concept because it's you never ever end up learning, stopping learning, and so the context that you've finished an Agile transformation just doesn't work for me. But having led a few, they never ended up in the path that I thought they were going to end up in.
Really?
And the reason is because it's about behavior. It's about a complex system. People are the most complex things that we have. Mm-hmm. They don't operate in a programmatic way. They're not determinative. You can't predict how someone's going to react to something because there are so many different things happening around it. And then once you start multiplying that out, you end up with a really complex system of work that sits around the things that you're doing. And so you never quite anticipate what's going to take off and what's not going to take off, and what's going to resonate with the culture of the organization that you're working with and the people within it, and what won't, because it's all different. So taking those small steps about what's the next thing that's the most important for us to learn together, and where do we have to learn that together? Because some things you have to learn together as an organization. So things like, how do you fund differently? How do you lead differently? How do you incent people differently? And other things you actually can learn individually. So teams can learn differently about the things that are slowing their work, the things that they as individuals might need to do differently. Those things can happen. And so setting those frameworks around how do we learn together, and what are the things we're going to learn as an organization versus the things we're going to learn as individuals or teams is really important as you go through these types of behavioral changes.
That's really interesting that you have to look, because I was just thinking as you were saying, things are funded differently, things are communicated differently, all this, different organizations. Having been a leader, it's very large organizations. What what are the commonalities? Like if you were talking to another leader saying, okay, I'm about to do one of these transformation, evolution, whatever things in my company, what would you say? Okay, here's what you should be looking for.
So the big commonality is we're all here for a purpose or for an outcome, and that outcome will translate into a financial outcome. It'll translate into a customer slash member outcome, whether you're a mutual or whether you're a shareholding based company. And when you think about it, it'll translate into a risk-based outcome. So the immutables of the things that actually sit on top of how companies are performing are the same no matter where you are. And you don't do an agile transformation to not achieve your corporate goals or purpose. You may argue that the agile transformation is the lead measure of your ability to do that versus a process or a process you're using to deliver that metric that you're pushing through. But you're never, ever going to get away from the fact that you have to translate it back into business terms. And as an executive, most executives have been brought up with those being their business terms. I will always have to go in front of a board and talk about risk. I'll have to talk about operational resilience. I'll have to talk about, as a CIO, if I was a business-facing leader or CEO, I'd have to talk about revenue and I'd have to talk about cost. I talk about cost as a technologist as well. Those things never go away. And so you can't pretend they don't exist and we're just going to iterate along on a journey. And getting that translation through and that suspension of what drives those in reality is really important, because we think often plans and projects drive those outcomes. But actually we know, because of the number of projects that fail and the number of things that don't achieve their end outcomes, that they don't really. We're sort of just making it up based on the best guesses that we think of what we think and predict might happen. What Agile says is that I'm going to try and work out what the most important thing is to drive that outcome. How then do I iterate towards that? How do I measure that I've got there? And then how do I do the next thing? And you're trying to reduce the distance between the decision making and your ability to change and pivot as you go through, which actually gives you more ability to achieve those outcomes. But it's really hard for people to not have that certainty. And it's really hard at an executive layer not to have that certainty that you feel you get by someone going, no, I'm going to manage this to a certain date, or I'm going to manage this to a certain cost, knowing that you will frequently be surprised. And history says you'll be surprised.
I was in a board meeting in a large organization, and there's different parts of the organization. Some of them are very agile, some of them are very traditional. It's a pretty big company, and finally they brought up like all their risk things, and every indicator was red. It was just like we're in trouble. And then I said, well, why are you even arguing with me about whether we should be doing an agile process or not? I don't even have to prove. I can prove that what you're doing now isn't working. And yet there still is such this resistance of, well, we need the 5-year plan. If we don't have that, how do we do this? And it's like, but it's not working now. How do you overcome that?
Yeah. And so the answer is you need the 5-year plan. What you're talking about, it's not the 5-year plan. You're not talking about the aspirations of the things that you think are going to drive a 5-year plan. What you're talking about is the way that you as an organization are going to deliver the 5-year plan, and the way that you're going to get better certainty on the things that might take you away from that delivery. So, if you take a look at, one of our aspirations is to put 50% of our lending for first home buyers. We want to get more people owning their first home. And so we want to grow the number of first home owners we've got, and we want to make sure that out of all the lending we do, 50% of it's to people buying their first home, which means you effectively that we're going to, you don't buy your first home twice. So it's going to be new customers to us who are buying their first home, who we've enabled into the business. Fabulous. We've got an idea of the levers. Even in a corporate plan, you've got an idea of the levers that are going to drive that. Some of it's going to be product. Some of it's going to be the way we manage risk. It's going to be the way we manage capital, whole raft of things. And then the question is, what's going to be the hardest thing? What's going to be the most risky things on that plan? If we ran steady state, what do we think we're likely to achieve? And then what are the things that we could learn that might accelerate that? And what we learned was that actually there were gaps in the market where people had the affordability to buy their first homes, but actually weren't buying their first homes because of the fact that they weren't falling into the traditional products. So we took a chance. We launched some non-traditional products. So we did a loan which effectively recognizes your ability to pay rent, as opposed to whether you have a large deposit and a large salary. If you've been able to pay a certain amount of rent up front for a regular period of time, chances are you're going to pay your mortgage.
Right.
So we launched a product and we've found out that yes, people want to have a look at that product. It's been a product that's made a difference for a number of people. And what we've learned is that actually it helps them, some of them, work out that actually they can get a different mortgage, not a proper mortgage, because they're all proper mortgages.
Yeah.
They can get a more traditional mortgage, but they never thought they could. So we've got a twofold approach of some people are getting a mortgage that couldn't get a traditional mortgage, and some people are getting traditional mortgage that didn't think they could. And we learned that by going, how would we accelerate our ability to deliver to our corporate plan? That's standard corporate planning. That's not something different, but it's
Right.
about ensuring that you're thinking about what's the next thing to learn. How do I de-risk? How do I take away the things that are the unknowns, that gap to plan that you always have? What do I need to learn to do that? And the same happens with agile delivery. It's the same learning approach that gives you that benefit in both cases. And you look at it with all of the tech startups, often the benefit they've got is they're not afraid of learning.
Right.
They're not afraid of putting something out. They're not afraid of seeing what people say and rapidly iterating. They don't spend a long time going, let's prove that this is going to actually work for us. When in reality, because humans are complex, proving is really hard. There are very few things that you can prove that require human behavior en masse at the end of them. You can predict it, you can get a sense of it, but actually, it's not determinative, because humans aren't determinative.
Right. I want to go back to something I think that really echoes on that when you were saying that, we know that actually all the plans and projects don't drive the success that we think they drive because they fail so often. And is it just the actual act of trying things, whether in one way, whether they work or not in the way you think they are, that drives that value?
100%. 100%. I had a great question come up at my team's all-team meeting today when we were talking about the learning we'd made from our app rollout, where someone said, now that you've seen that the fallout rates are far lower, could you have gone faster? Could you have actually deployed earlier? Have you gone too far on what you've created? Because actually you thought previously 30% was what it was going to be. Now, we hadn't had a conversation around, was that acceptable? And in my mind, that's not acceptable.
Right.
But, 1% is probably a little bit too low. And so, that ability to go back and to learn and to challenge is really, really important. And to recognize that, sometimes even though everyone's worked really hard, your way of thinking needs to the way you think about things needs to be that constant ability to come back. And you asked about failures. I have been associated with projects that have been really, really hard to get in, and where you'd go, no. And in fact, early in my career, I got taken off a project, which just kept failing at the last point as we tried to put it live. We'd done all the work, we'd done all the prep, and it just kept failing in the live environment. We discovered, and this will date me, it was a Windows 3.1 bug where if you dragged the mouse, it actually conflicted with the network card. It took processor away, because this is in the days of single processor machines. So, so all this conflict.
But still, who would have thought? Who would have thought?
But who would have thought we couldn't predict it until we got into the live environment? And even in the live environment, it took us about a month to work out it was just that it was a sloppy mouse movement that was causing the intermittent problem that we had. And I was devastated because I'd planned so hard to get this project across the line. And the answer was, you've learned a lot out of it. You're tired now. You need to go and get someone else to now pull it across the line. You've solved the problem, but now we need to iterate and learn from something else. So projects, no matter how well you plan them, sometimes don't end up where you need them to be. And that learning of what you do differently. Now I know what I do differently. And my learning from that was, don't get the best, most talented staff doing your UAT. Get some of those people who are the ones who always break things.
Right.
That we'd planned it really well. We'd planned some career progression for people into tech BA roles through doing this work and all those things. And sometimes it just doesn't come off. I think and that costs time and money to delay.
And I think that's a great example of a complex system of systems working, because no one who designed the mouse or the mouse logic or the network card had ever talked to each other, had ever thought about how they would work together. And the only way you could possibly find that out is to do it. Like, nobody would have thought of that.
Yeah. And this was way back, as I said, dated myself, the Windows 3.1. Yeah.
So going back to how you think, it's that, and one of the things I really love you talk about, that bendy snake, where if you just replace one process with another process and it doesn't work, it's the process's fault, not what they're learning. And so when you put in a new way of working, which you've done a few different times in different organizations, how do you begin? Like, how do you start that?
You rarely get to start, okay, because everyone's done this type of stuff. And in fact, sometimes people have done it too many times and have all the scars of having the things that they haven't seen work from them. So you rarely get to start. And I've never, ever got to start a new way of working. I've always joined an organization where some teams thought that they had great ways of working and were working in what we'd call an agile manner. Others were where there'd been previous attempts to train people in a particular methodology or a particular approach, and the organization I've joined now was heading down a methodology-based conversation. The challenge is you can end up arguing the methodology forever, because the methodologies are fairly similar. They're all based in the same foundations, which is iteration, fast learning, fast failure, certain visibility of work, the ability to measure, the ability to learn. All of those things are common, and you can find more commonalities than not. And they're all applicable in different places or different ways. And so what I've often had to do is take people on the learning journey. So what is the question we're trying to solve? What's the purpose we're all here for? What's the first thing we need to achieve? And the teams actually tend to embrace that, because that's how you start liberating people to have more control over the things that they can do, and they can get closer to the work they're doing, rather than feeling that someone's given them work to do that they just following a process to deliver. So on one side you do that, but on the other side, it's often the system around the work that makes the work not happen. You hear about tech teams that are fabulous, that they can deploy constantly, but they're still given work in project-based formats, or they're still given work in a way that has deadlines against it. So they're working time-boxed iterations against deliverables that have been set top-down. And so the other thing that I've found that I always have to do is work out what the system constraints are, and spend as much time outside the organizations that are trying to do change, working with them on how they actually help the process work. So your risk teams, your people teams, your finance teams, it's often the broader organization that slows down your ability to learn unintentionally, because we all think that we've got really valuable things that we need to deliver for us, versus we're all lined up behind the valuable thing that we need to deliver for our member or for our colleague.
Right.
So, financial funding is a really good one. Stage gate funding. Let's make your business case and prove before you get through stage gate funding. Spending time with the finance team, actually talking to them about how many of those business cases are real, how many of them actually have the data, how much are we spending to get to business case, versus what could we actually iterate to learn, so we might get some more certainty that we'll get the benefits out the end. Talking to your people teams about incentives. And so how do we make sure that our teams are lined up behind the right work and not necessarily working against each other? How do we reward people for some failure? How do we drive the right behaviors? And then when you start talking to your risk teams, how do we move to risk and audit being embedded in the work as opposed to overlaid on top of the work? And so how do we get the risk frameworks recognizing that agile initiatives are going to bubble up risks in a different way to the way that we might have traditionally done it if we were using Gantt or project-based, or potentially the way that frameworks work. And actually risk has taken a real transformation in the last sort of 10 years, particularly across the regulated industries I've been a part of, because they recognize the need to have lead and lag measures, and they recognize the need to be able to monitor controls. And when you think about learning, actually that's what learning does. You need to measure, you need to understand what's happening. Is it something that you want to amplify, or is it something you want to reduce? And then what's the action you're going to take? And so once you start having those systemic conversations around the side, you really can liberate the teams to get on and do the next thing that's going to give the best value. But unless you do that, they're going to feel like they've got their arms tied behind their back.
Right. So you're talking about changing this. It's like the operating model needs to shift to enabling the teams to deliver value, rather than, okay, we're just going to fix these, teams that are delivering stuff without the whole system of systems around it.
Correct.
So when, what does it look like when you sort of, we've talked about this before, you and I, about how it just feels different. Like when you sort of go in, it could be the same teams, the same people, in some ways doing some of the same things, but it feels different. So what are you looking for as a leader in how it feels? How do you know, like, okay, you walk into org, I know something has changed. And how does that work?
So it's the questions people ask. It's the way you see them thinking about value. It's the way you see them measuring and taking time for reflection. And so, one of the best conversations we had today was a two-sided conversation where I asked the team that was talking about our app and portal rollout to my broader technology team, what have you learned now, and what would you do differently next time? And they said, we'd more quickly determine what value is and how we could work on that, as opposed to some of the things that we perhaps did and thought were important, but actually now that we've got the first iteration out, we've worked out that some of those things weren't as important. And but we were worried that our borrowers wouldn't see value because it wasn't that much better than what they had today. And actually, it was really nice because one of our internal colleagues who has migrated as an external borrower said that what you've rolled out is fabulous. It's easy to use. It's got it's got just a little bit more information. I know more is coming. And actually, it's really nice to get it in my hands and to be able to feel it rather than not. And so those types of conversations are the symbols that tell you that things are starting to happen. I look for work stopping. I look for more challenge in the organization.
Mhm.
So where are you getting more noise? Where are you getting people sort of going, hey, but I want to go, and you're saying no. And where do I hear about that as opposed to the work just stalling? And you can see that in metrics, so you can see that in blocked time.
Mhm.
I look for more work being done in teams as opposed to across teams, so less handoffs,
Mhm.
because that says we're building our work the right way and we've built our architecture the right way. Because wearing my tech hat, it's not just about lining our people up behind the work. We've got to have our technology architecture in place to allow independent work so that you're not making people queue their work across multiple teams. So I look for that type of behavior where more teams are actually just owning and delivering and just getting on and not having to engage other people. So I get less complaints at a CIO level about resources and money and conflict around who's going to go first in someone's queue.
Right.
Those types of symbols for me, at an executive level, I hear less talk about dates and I hear more talk about value. We start seeing things stop. We get more predictability on our spend, and we get more and we can see a better velocity on the value that we're deploying. We haven't quite got there in my current organization. We've got velocity, we haven't got value measured as well as I'd like to. And so that's our focus for the next sort of 6 months or so. How do we ramp up the metrics that give us the lead indication that we've done the right work to get value out the door, as opposed to we've just done work? Because that's sort of the next evolution. We're doing work faster, but are we doing the right work faster?
Right.
And it's really interesting because I'd argue that most organizations have customer journeys down pat. What we don't really do very well is colleague journeys. And so every part of the organization thinks it's important. So my finance processes don't tend to map to my people processes, which don't tend to map to my procurement processes.
Right.
And actually, you know what? Which don't map to my risk processes. So I've got a system that tells me what my risks are. I've got a system that tells me what the people are and what my finances are. But actually, I can't work out whether I'm going to hit my budget unless I sort of know my people. And I don't know whether I'm spending in the right areas against risk unless I can correlate the two. And it's one of those really interesting mindset shifts that says, actually, it's about the colleague journey and enabling the colleague to do their job. I hit it all the time in tech because most people have really simple budgets and businesses and head counts because they just really have people and money. Tech tends to have contracts, and then you have contractors, and then you have consulting companies that come in, and then you have people as well, and then you have change spend and you have run spend. So you start getting really complex. And when that's fragmented, it's really, really hard to be able to go, are we doing it efficiently? And then when one of my CEOs of Homes or Money says to me, but how much am I spending on you? And how many of your people are really working on me? Actually being able to cut so that you can cut from the customer down, the processes and the way that it works and the things that we're doing, is really, really hard. And so organizations need to, in that systemic switch that they're doing to help this journey, they almost need to turn around and remember that they're all here for the same reason, either for a customer or for a colleague.
Right.
We are all important. I have all these things that I must do in my job, but actually my job doesn't exist if I don't have customers or colleagues.
That is really, I love that idea of a colleague journey, because that is, that's the best way I've heard of describing sort of that organizational friction that just gets in the way. And not because anyone's intentionally doing it. It's just, well, what I'm doing is important, as you were saying.
Yeah. And your incentives align you, and your goals align you to your vertical silo.
Yeah.
So if you're in finance, you have a different set of goals potentially than the people in technology. And so we've just done some work around how do we enable our corporate plan, because we don't have a different corporate plan to the rest of the the Skipton Group, we have the same corporate plan, but our job is to make a stronger business. And so if what we're doing isn't to make a stronger business, if it's not making happier customers, and if it's not making healthier operations, then actually we shouldn't be doing the work. And so everything we do needs to dock into that, underpinning the external corporate plan that our heads of our businesses and our people plan has put in place. Because those really are the only two things that we're really here to support within the risk appetites that we have in play, of course. But without those, that's what we're here for. We're not here to deliver the thing that's in front of us, because I can deliver that and we can still fail at the macro level.
Yeah.
And that's what you often lose sight of in organizations. You get lots of people who are individually successful, but we've lost the big thing that we all set out to achieve. And that's partly what functionalization of work did to us, which is why Agile and getting cross-functional teams back together helps address that, because you can ground them in that purpose. You can ground them in the one thing that they're there to achieve, and take away some of those boundaries that mean that you get conflicts because of the organizational, I call it an organizational system, but some people call it the operating model, some people call it incentives. Those cause conflict, which stop you actually delivering the thing that's the most valuable. You asked me about symbols. Symbols, another symbol is actually people choosing not to deliver their piece of work to deliver someone else's. That is a big symbol of an organization that's focused on the right outcome.
That is such a great way of wrapping up what you were saying, Jen. That is, I love that statement. That is really powerful. So Jenny Wood, CIO of the Skipton Group, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, JJ.
The Agile CEO is brought to you by Scrum Inc. In today's fast-paced world, adaptability is key. Our expert consulting services tailor transformations that drive measurable success, creating resilient, high-performing organizations. Whether you're leading a team, managing an organization, or guiding enterprise-level change, we're here to support your journey. Transform with confidence and achieve the outcomes that matter. Learn more at scruminc.com.